I was born in Thomasville, Georgia in 1950, and I have lived there for 58 years.
Same house, I understand.
Same house.
What was it like when you were growing up?
The house itself has been through many transformations. It's had rooms added on and rooms torn off and bedrooms turned into porches and porches turned into bathrooms and then turned back into porches. So although I've lived in the same house, it has felt like a different house through the years. Some of the changes were improvements and some were not improvements, but it's now a very nice, comfortable house. And my sister lives with me now in the house where she too grew up.
Okay, just look at me on this, make sure you don't glance over.
Yes.
He's better looking than I am. Avid reader when you were growing up?
Yes, I was. I was an avid reader, and my father wrote children's books. So I had a feeling that books were something that could be written by family members.
When did you first get a sense that you might be a writer?
I didn't think about being a writer until I was in my 40s.
Now before that, what was your career that you were in?
I taught school. I taught first grade in Thomasville, Georgia, from when I got out of college until I took up my writing career. Writing is very private, and I think it is a good job for a shy person, somebody who's not comfortable in the public eye, because you can go into a room and write anything you want, and you can be anybody you want if you choose different narrators for your work. And it's a little shocking when the work is finished and you have to come out with it. And one mistake readers often make is to assume that the narrator in the book has the same personality as the writer, and it can be very different. In lots of my writing, I have this very genial, affable, easygoing seeming narrator who's very different from me. And I remember once when I was on a book tour, somebody came up to me with great distress and said, "I thought you were going to be a little white-haired lady who wrote." And I'm not. I'm kind of dark and dreary seeming in person, but in my writing I can be anybody.
Now I disagree with that last statement there, but you then have to step out and wonder whether the world approves of what you've done and step into the public eye with what you've done as a private person. What's that like?
It's very disconcerting, and it's I wonder sometimes why publishers and publicity agents feel that writers are going to be good performers. And when a new book comes out and the writer is sent off on the book trip and has to stand up every night and give a little performance, it's scary and uncomfortable feeling, because you do feel like you're disappointing your readers. Your readers like what they've read, and then they want to meet the writer, and sometimes the writer is not who they hope to see.
There's a whole multi-level thing of relationships that a writer has. One, most intimate probably with the reader, but you also have publicists, and you've got all the people that make the book happen here. What is it like to orchestrate through those things, and what is your relationship, especially with the reader?
Choosing an ideal reader can be helpful if your ideal reader has universal tastes and is a broad reader. But sometimes writers make the mistake of choosing an ideal reader with a very narrow focus. And I think I've done that a few times. I once chose an ideal reader who was a peanut pathologist. He studied diseases of peanut plants. And he became my ideal reader, and I wrote a whole book about plant pathology and peanuts. And nobody could read it except my ideal reader. My ideal reader loved it, but the rest of the world, I had people say, I just couldn't get through that book. But I had a good ideal reader, and he loves the book to this day.
Have you grown as a writer and changed much as a writer as you've written more and more?
I have changed as a writer, I'm sure, because when I first started writing, I wrote for the radio, and I wrote very, very, very short essays. And then I wrote a novel that was quite long and tedious, I now believe, although I loved it at the time. And sometimes your growth as a writer gets taken out of your hands, and in my case, it has taken on a new life because I'm now working on writing a murder mystery, which is something I never thought I would do. But I have a cousin who's not a writer, but an avid reader of murder mysteries and has a very lively mind in that area. And she called me on the phone one day and said, I've thought up your next book. And she told me this wonderful story that she dreamed up of murder and very sordid goings-on in a small southern town. And I said, you need to write it. She said, I can't write. So we've been collaborating on this book now for about 3 years, and we have 15 chapters written.
Young people might want to write, but there's a skill that's involved with writing that requires quite a bit of training along the way. Mm-hmm. The importance of being imaginative in writing, but then of also understanding the tools of your trade and learning to write better. It's how important is it in the educational system for young people to learn to write and even translate that into how they communicate.
Mm-hmm. I was lucky to have a very good 6th grade teacher named Miss Ray, who was a very good and strict grammar teacher. So I learned grammar in 6th grade, and it stuck with me. And I think that is a very basic tool for a writer. And beyond knowing grammar, I think a writer needs to read. I think that's the best way to learn to write, is to read. And as you read more and more, you will develop a liking for certain styles, and you will write imitatively for a long time, just copying your favorite writer's styles. But then as you keep reading and keep writing, you develop your own writing style. And I think people learn to write more from reading than from being taught writing.
Tell me why you think it's important that writers are brought together in events like the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame and are recognized for their efforts.
I think it's such a valuable experience for writers to be brought together, because our writing lives are so private, and even meeting with our readers is not as close sometimes as meeting with other writers, because there's a certain core of ourselves that we understand. And I'm looking forward so much to seeing Pharoah Sams, one of my favorite writers. When I was just beginning, and I'd come to Atlanta after my first book was published, and I was very nervous about being in the bookstore and with an audience. And Pharoah Sams came sweeping up the aisle with a huge sheaf of lilies that he'd grown in his garden and presented them to me. And that was such a touching thing that he did, to acknowledge me, a new writer, as joining the group of Georgia writers. And now I'm in the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame with Pharoah Sams and other fine writers that I'm looking forward to visiting on this week. Well, I would say an important thing for young people is just to write a lot. If they're interested in writing and hope someday to be a writer, to just sit and write. One thing that's useful for me that sounds silly is that I enjoy typing. And I thought that was just kind of a useless pleasure. But I've just read a biography of Jack Kerouac, and I read his biographer said that Jack Kerouac would sometimes sit up all night and type just for the pleasure of typing. And I think that that's an important part of writing, is to know that not everything you write is going to be suitable for readers. A lot of what you write, page after page that gets thrown away, is just typing, but it's part of learning to be a writer.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you where you went in your room and you said, he's probably going to ask me this, so I probably ought to think of what to answer for that? Anything along those lines? Because you've said some of the magic things that I really liked. I love you have to imagine a reader who would read your material. Maybe what have been your favorite things that you've done?
It's hard to talk about the favorite things you've written, because it's sad when you have to say that your favorite thing you've written you wrote about 20 years ago. I always have a soft feeling for whatever I'm working on now, and when I finished it and look back at it a year or two later, I may not like it so much, but I like what I'm working on now.
Tell me about the joy that you feel. It's because it's a self-expression thing when you're writing, and it's why you do it, isn't it?
I'm one of those writers who keeps a journal or diary, and that's a great pleasure, to just sit down and write something that only I will ever read. And sometimes I wonder, why am I doing this and keeping these 3-ring binders year after year? And as you get older, you wonder what's going to happen to all your stuff. And then one day I realized that the pleasure is in the doing it, not in the keeping it or reading it later or having other people read it. But I think that's a valuable thing for young writers to do too, is to keep a journal, write down things that they note of interest in their daily lives, and just write down their thoughts and what the weather is like that day maybe.